Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she watched the target vehicle through her grandfather's scope. The convoy was moving faster now, responding to the previous shot attempts, but there was still a narrow window of opportunity before they would disappear around a bend in the mountain road. Every second counted, and Sarah knew she would have only one chance to prove that her grandfather's techniques could succeed where modern technology had failed. The wind conditions were exactly as her grandfather had described in his notebook. Mountain valleys created predictable air current patterns, and Sarah had been observing these patterns for the past hour. She could see the subtle signs that indicated when the wind would briefly stabilize, the way dust settled, how vegetation moved, and the pattern of heat distortion rising from the valley floor. Her grandfather's notes had taught her to read these natural indicators rather than relying on electronic instruments. Through her scope, Sarah could see the target clearly despite the extreme distance. Her grandfather's rifle had been customized with precision components that were unusual for a hunting weapon, though they appeared crude compared to modern military equipment. The scope itself was a masterpiece of old-world craftsmanship, with glass lenses that had been hand-ground to specifications that her grandfather had developed through years of experimentation. Sarah began her final breathing sequence, exactly as her grandfather had taught her during their hunting trips in Colorado. She exhaled slowly, allowing her heart rate to decrease and her body to become perfectly still. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, familiar and comfortable in a way that her military-issued weapon never had. Every surface of the stock and trigger had been worn smooth by her grandfather's hands and then further shaped by her own practice sessions. The calculations running through Sarah's mind were not based on electronic readings or computer algorithms. Instead, she was applying formulas that her grandfather had developed through decades of practical experience. These calculations took into account factors that weren't programmed into modern equipment: the way bullet trajectory changed at extreme altitudes, how mountain thermals affected wind patterns, and the subtle physics of bullet behavior at distances beyond conventional ranges. Lieutenant Colonel Harris was monitoring the situation through his binoculars, growing increasingly concerned as the target convoy approached the end of the engagement zone. The primary snipers had expended their best opportunities, and it appeared that the mission would end in failure. He was about to order the team to withdraw when he noticed that Sarah was preparing to take a shot with her grandfather's rifle. Harris felt a mixture of hope and anxiety as he realized what was about to happen. Sarah's unconventional approach had seemed questionable during the mission planning phase, but now it represented their last chance for success. He keyed his radio to warn the spotters to track Sarah's shot, knowing that this moment would either vindicate her faith in her grandfather's techniques or demonstrate the limitations of traditional methods. That the other snipers had also noticed Sarah's preparation and were watching with skeptical attention. Some of them were already preparing explanations for why the mission had failed, frustrated by their inability to adapt their sophisticated equipment to the challenging mountain conditions. They remained doubtful that an old hunting rifle could succeed where their advanced military weapons had failed. Sarah's breathing reached the perfect rhythm described in her grandfather's notes. She could feel her heartbeat slowing and her vision becoming crystal clear. The target vehicle was moving through a section of road that offered the clearest shot, but this opportunity would last only a few more seconds. Everything depended on her ability to execute the shooting technique that her grandfather had perfected through decades of hunting in similar terrain. The moment of perfect wind stability arrived exactly as Sarah had predicted. She could sense the change in air pressure and see the subtle signs that indicated optimal shooting conditions. Her grandfather's notebook had described this phenomenon in detail, explaining how experienced marksmen could learn to recognize these brief windows of opportunity. Modern equipment measured these conditions, but it took human intuition to truly understand them. Sarah's finger applied steady pressure to the trigger, following the technique that her grandfather had drilled into her during countless practice sessions. The trigger broke cleanly, and the rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the mountain valley. The recoil was familiar and comfortable, exactly as she remembered from her training with her grandfather years earlier. The bullet began its journey across more than 3 kilometers of mountain air, following a trajectory that had been calculated using techniques developed long before modern ballistics computers existed. Sarah's grandfather had understood that extreme distance shooting was as much art as science. requiring an intuitive understanding of environmental factors that couldn't be reduced to simple mathematical formulas. Time seemed to slow as everyone waited to see the result of Sarah's shot. The spotters trained their binoculars on the target vehicle, tracking the bullet's flight path across the vast distance. Lieutenant Colonel Harris held his breath, knowing that the success or failure of this shot would have implications far beyond the immediate mission. Sarah remained in her shooting position, following through with her grandfather's technique even as the bullet traveled toward its target. The seconds stretched endlessly as the bullet covered the enormous distance to the target. Sarah's calculation had accounted for bullet drop, wind drift, and atmospheric conditions using methods that predated modern technology by decades. Her grandfather's notebook contained the wisdom of a master marksman who had learned to read the environment with an accuracy that electronic instruments struggled to match. Radio chatter fell silent as everyone focused on the target area. The convoy was still moving, unaware that a perfectly aimed bullet was approaching at supersonic speed. Sarah's shot represented not just a tactical opportunity, but a test of whether traditional marksmanship skills could compete with the most advanced military technology available. The tension was unbearable as spotters continued tracking the target vehicle through their scopes. Sarah's grandfather's rifle had fired what might be the most important shot of her military career, and possibly one of the longest successful sniper shots in modern combat history. Everything now depended on whether decades of hunting wisdom could translate into battlefield success. The silence that followed Sarah's shot seemed to last forever. Through their binoculars and scopes, the entire sniper team watched the target vehicle continue moving down the mountain road, apparently unaffected by the bullet that should have arrived by now. Several team members began to shake their heads, assuming that Sarah's attempt had failed like the others. The distance had simply been too great, even for her grandfather's legendary rifle. Then suddenly the target vehicle swerved violently to the left and came to an abrupt stop. Spotters focused their scopes on the scene and reported what they were seeing with growing excitement. The target had been eliminated with surgical precision, despite the incredible distance and challenging conditions. Sarah's shot had found its mark exactly where she had aimed, demonstrating accuracy that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Harris immediately got on the radio to confirm the kill, with multiple spotters positioned throughout the valley. Each confirmation added to the growing realization that something extraordinary had just occurred. The shot distance was measured and remeasured by different teams using various methods, and every calculation confirmed the same incredible result: 210 meters. This was far beyond the range of any confirmed sniper kill in military history. The other snipers were stunned into silence. Their advanced rifles and electronic equipment had failed to achieve what Sarah had accomplished with her grandfather's hunting rifle. The weapon they had mocked and dismissed as obsolete had just delivered the most precise long-range shot any of them had ever witnessed. Their assumptions about modern technology versus traditional methods had been completely overturned in a single moment. Sarah remained in her shooting position for several more seconds, following through with her grandfather's technique even after the successful hit had been confirmed. She felt a deep sense of connection to her grandfather's memory, knowing that his decades of research and experimentation had finally been validated in the most dramatic way possible. The leather notebook had contained the key to achieving what modern military science considered impossible. Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to break the stunned silence among the sniper team. He approached Sarah's position with a mixture of amazement and embarrassment, recognizing that his skepticism about her unconventional methods had been completely misplaced. Rodriguez had witnessed many impressive shots during his military career, but nothing that compared to what Sarah had just accomplished with equipment that belonged in a museum. The radio crackled with excited chatter as word of the successful mission spread throughout the military command structure. Intelligence officials who had planned the operation were amazed to learn that the target had been eliminated, despite the extreme distance and challenging conditions. They requested immediate confirmation of the shot distance, unable to believe that such a feat was possible with any existing military equipment. Harris began the process of documenting the shot for official military records. The distance measurement had to be verified by multiple independent sources using GPS coordinates and laser rangefinders. Every aspect of the shot would be scrutinized, by military officials who would struggle to understand how an old hunting rifle had achieved results that surpassed the most advanced sniper systems in the world. Sarah finally stood up from her shooting position and began the careful process of securing her grandfather's rifle. The weapon had just made history, but to her it remained a cherished family heirloom that connected her to a man who had understood the art of precision shooting better than anyone realized. She checked the rifle for any signs of damage from the extreme shot, but the sturdy construction had handled the stress perfectly. The leather notebook that had guided Sarah through the shot calculations would become an important piece of evidence in documenting the record. Military ballistics experts would spend weeks analyzing her grandfather's techniques, trying to understand how an amateur hunter had developed methods that surpassed professional military training. The notebook contained insights that would influence sniper training programs for years to come. As the team prepared to leave their positions, Sarah took a moment to reflect on what had just occurred. The shot had not only completed their mission successfully, but had also vindicated her faith in her grandfather's legacy. The man who had taught her to shoot in the Colorado mountains had developed techniques that could compete with the most advanced technology available to modern military forces. The other snipers approached Sarah with new respect and curiosity about her grandfather's methods. They wanted to understand how traditional techniques had achieved results that their electronic equipment couldn't match. The jokes and skepticism that had characterized their previous interactions were replaced by genuine interest in learning from her experience. Harris coordinated the team's extraction while simultaneously fielding radio calls from superior officers who wanted to understand how the mission had been accomplished. The success would be analyzed and studied by military strategists, but Harris knew that the real story was about the power of experience and intuition over pure technology. Sarah's grandfather had understood something about long-range shooting that modern equipment couldn't replicate. Word was already spreading through military channels about the incredible shot. Ballistics experts at the Pentagon would soon be requesting detailed reports about the rifle and techniques used. Sarah's name would be entered into military record books alongside her grandfather's, creating a legacy that would inspire future generations of marksmen. The convoy of vehicles that had brought the sniper team to their positions was now returning them to base, but the mood was completely different from the tense anticipation of the morning journey. Sarah had not only completed the mission, but had achieved something that would be talked about in military circles for decades. Her grandfather's rifle had proven that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. As they drove through the mountain roads back to base, Sarah looked at her grandfather's rifle with new appreciation. The weapon had just set a world record that might never be broken, but more importantly, it had honored the memory of a man whose wisdom had been passed down through generations. The shot at 210 meters would become legendary, but for Sarah it was simply the culmination of everything her grandfather had taught her about the art of precision shooting. The alarm sounded at dawn, jolting the entire base into action. Intelligence had detected a high-value enemy target moving through a valley approximately 3 kilometers away from their position. The target was traveling with a small convoy, and this represented a rare opportunity to eliminate a key figure in the enemy organization. Lieutenant Colonel Harris quickly assembled his best snipers for a briefing. The mission seemed straightforward on paper, but the reality was far more complex. The target would be moving through a narrow mountain pass that offered only a few vantage points for a clean shot. The distance involved was extreme, even by military standards. Most concerning was the unpredictable mountain weather, which could change wind patterns and visibility within minutes. Harris looked around the room at his assembled snipers. Each one was equipped with the latest military hardware, including advanced scopes with electronic rangefinders and wind meters. These weapons represented millions of dollars in research and development, designed to give soldiers every possible advantage in combat situations. The technology was impressive, but the shot they were facing would challenge even the most sophisticated equipment. Sarah sat quietly in the back of the briefing room, listening as Harris explained the tactical situation. The other snipers were already discussing equipment modifications and calculating bullet trajectories using their electronic devices. She noticed that several of them seemed concerned about the distance involved. Even with their advanced rifles, the shot would be at the very edge of their effective range. After the briefing, Sarah approached Lieutenant Colonel Harris privately. She requested permission to participate in the mission using her grandfather's rifle. Harris looked at her with surprise and concern. The idea of using an old hunting rifle for such a critical military operation seemed almost absurd. He reminded Sarah that the mission's success could impact the safety of their entire unit and the broader strategic situation. Sarah explained that her grandfather's rifle had capabilities that weren't immediately obvious. She showed Harris some of the entries in the leather notebook, pointing out calculations that suggested the weapon could perform accurately at distances far beyond what conventional wisdom would suggest. Harris remained skeptical, but he had learned to respect Sarah's judgment during their time working together. The other snipers were less diplomatic when they learned about Sarah's request. They openly questioned whether she was putting personal sentiment ahead of mission success. Some suggested that she was being reckless by wanting to use untested equipment in such a high-stakes situation. The criticism was sharper than the usual good-natured teasing she had endured about her rifle. Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the more experienced snipers, pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. He expressed genuine concern that her attachment to the rifle was clouding her professional judgment. Rodriguez had been in combat situations where equipment failure meant the difference between life and death. He couldn't understand why anyone would choose unproven gear when lives were on the line. Sarah listened respectfully to the criticism, but she remained convinced that her grandfather's rifle offered advantages that the modern weapons lacked. She had spent months studying his techniques and had achieved remarkable results during practice sessions. More importantly, she had developed an intuitive understanding of how the weapon behaved under different environmental conditions. Harris faced a difficult decision. The mission timeline was tight, and he couldn't afford to have his snipers distracted by internal disagreements. At the same time, he recognized that Sarah's unconventional approach might offer unique advantages. The target they were pursuing was notoriously difficult to locate, and previous attempts to eliminate him using conventional methods had failed. After careful consideration, Harris made a compromise decision. He would allow Sarah to accompany the mission team with her grandfather's rifle, but she would be positioned as backup to the primary snipers. If the conventional approach failed or if an unexpected opportunity arose, she would have the chance to prove her rifle's capabilities. This arrangement satisfied the need for proven equipment while acknowledging Sarah's specialized skills. The team began immediate preparations for departure. While the other snipers calibrated their electronic scopes and tested their equipment, Sarah performed her own pre-mission routine. She carefully cleaned her grandfather's rifle and reviewed his notes about shooting in mountainous terrain. The leather notebook contained specific observations about how altitude and terrain features could affect bullet trajectory. As the team prepared to move out, Sarah noticed that some of her fellow soldiers were still making quiet jokes about her choice of weapon. However, the mood was more serious than usual due to the importance of the mission. Everyone understood that failure could have significant consequences, not just for their unit, but for the broader military operation in the region. The convoy of vehicles departed the base just as the sun was reaching its peak. The drive to the sniper positions would take several hours through challenging mountain terrain. Sarah used the travel time to study topographical maps and weather reports, trying to anticipate the conditions they would face at the target location. During the journey, Sarah reflected on all the training and preparation that had led to this moment. She thought about her grandfather and the countless hours he had spent teaching her to shoot in similar mountain conditions. The techniques in his notebook had been developed through decades of experience, and she was about to find out whether that experience could translate into success in a real combat situation. The team was heading toward a confrontation that would test everything they had learned about long-distance marksmanship. For Sarah, it was more than just a military mission. It was an opportunity to validate her grandfather's legacy and prove that traditional wisdom still had value in a world dominated by advanced technology. The sniper team reached their designated positions just as the afternoon sun began casting long shadows across the mountain valley. The primary snipers quickly set up their advanced equipment on a rocky outcrop that offered a clear view of the target's expected route. Their electronic rangefinders confirmed what everyone already knew. The distance to the kill zone was approximately 200 meters, pushing the absolute limits of their weapons' capabilities. Sarah established her position about 50 meters away from the main team, following Lieutenant Colonel Harris's instructions to serve as backup support. From her vantage point, she had a slightly different angle on the valley below, but the distance was essentially the same. She carefully unpacked her grandfather's rifle and began her own preparation routine, which looked strangely primitive compared to the high-tech setup of her colleagues. While the other snipers calibrated their electronic scopes and consulted digital weather stations, Sarah relied on techniques her grandfather had taught her decades earlier. She observed the movement of grass and leaves to judge wind patterns at different elevations. She noted the way heat waves rose from sun-warmed rocks, creating subtle distortions in the air that could affect bullet trajectory. These observations went into mental calculations based on formulas from the leather notebook. The waiting began. Intelligence reports indicated that the target convoy would pass through the valley within the next 2 hours, but mountain travel was unpredictable. Weather conditions could delay the convoy, or they might take an alternate route if they suspected surveillance. The snipers settled into their positions, knowing that they might have to remain motionless for hours while maintaining constant readiness. As time passed, Sarah noticed that the other snipers were making frequent adjustments to their equipment. Wind conditions in the mountains were constantly changing, and their electronic systems were registering variations that required compensation. The sophisticated technology was designed to account for these variables, but the constant adjustments seemed to create uncertainty rather than confidence. Sarah's approach was different. Instead of fighting the changing conditions, she tried to understand the patterns. Her grandfather's notes contained observations about how mountain winds typically behaved during different times of day and weather conditions. Rather than making constant mechanical adjustments, she focused on developing a feel for the environment and timing her shot to coincide with favorable conditions. Sergeant Rodriguez, positioned at the primary sniper location, was growing increasingly concerned about the wind conditions. His electronic measurements showed gusts varying by more than 10 miles per hour, which would significantly affect bullet trajectory at extreme distances. He communicated his concerns to Lieutenant Colonel Harris via radio, suggesting that the shot might be impossible under current conditions. The radio crackled with reports from scouts positioned throughout the valley. The target convoy had been spotted entering the mountain pass and was approximately 30 minutes away from the kill zone. This news brought a mixture of anticipation and anxiety to the sniper team. They would soon discover whether their equipment and training were sufficient for this extraordinary challenge. Sarah checked her grandfather, his rifle one final time, and reviewed the key points from his notebook. According to his calculations, the shot she was contemplating was theoretically possible, but it would require perfect timing and execution. She would need to fire during a brief window when wind conditions were optimal, and she would have to account for factors that weren't fully covered in her military training. As the convoy approached, the primary snipers began their final preparations. Their advanced scopes were locked onto the target area, and they had calculated bullet drop and wind compensation based on their electronic readings. However, the constantly changing mountain conditions made it difficult to achieve the precision required for such an extreme distance shot. The first vehicle of the convoy came into view in the valley below. Through her grandfather's simpler but well-maintained scope, Sarah could make out individual figures in the vehicles. The target was traveling in the second vehicle, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The convoy was moving slowly due to the rough mountain road, which would provide a relatively stable shooting opportunity. Rodriguez took the first shot using his state-of-the-art military rifle. The bullet's trajectory was tracked by spotters, who reported that it impacted several meters short of the target. The extreme distance and challenging wind conditions had defeated even the most advanced equipment. Rodriguez quickly chambered another round and recalculated his aim, but the convoy was already reacting to the attack. A second sniper attempted a shot from a different angle, but his bullet also failed to find its mark. The convoy vehicles were now accelerating and taking evasive action, making subsequent shots even more difficult. Radio chatter indicated growing frustration among the primary snipers, who were struggling to adapt their high-tech equipment to the challenging environmental conditions. Sarah watched these attempts while making her own final calculations. According to her grandfather's techniques, the other snipers were overthinking the problem. Their electronic systems were providing too much information, creating analysis paralysis rather than shooting confidence. Her grandfather's approach emphasized intuitive understanding of the environment rather than mechanical precision. The target vehicle was nearing the end of the kill zone, and it appeared that the mission would fail. The convoy had increased speed significantly after the first shots, and the window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Lieutenant Colonel Harris was faced with the possibility of explaining to his superiors how a high-value target had escaped despite having multiple snipers in position. It was at this critical moment that Sarah made her decision. She had been observing the wind patterns for over an hour and had identified a brief period of relative stability that occurred roughly every few minutes. Her grandfather's notes had described similar conditions in mountain hunting situations, and she believed she understood the timing well enough to attempt the shot. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the breathing routine her grandfather had taught her. She ignored the radio chatter and electronic beeping from the other positions, focusing entirely on the relationship between herself, her rifle, and the target. Everything her grandfather had written about extreme distance shooting was about to be put to the ultimate test. Sarah Martinez had always been different from other soldiers in her unit. While her fellow Marines spent their free time playing cards or writing letters home, she could be found cleaning her grandfather's old hunting rifle. The weapon looked ancient compared to the modern sniper rifles used by the military. Its wooden stock was worn smooth from decades of use, and the metal showed signs of age despite her careful maintenance. The other soldiers often made jokes about Sarah's attachment to the old rifle. "Why don't you get a real weapon?" they would tease. "That thing belongs in a museum, not on a battlefield." Some laughed openly when they saw her practicing with it during her personal time. The rifle had been her grandfather's prized possession, a custom-built weapon he had used during his hunting expeditions in the mountains of Colorado. Sarah's grandfather, Miguel Martinez, had been a legendary marksman in his small town. Stories were told about his incredible shots during hunting season, but most people thought they were just tall tales. Before he passed away, he had given Sarah the rifle along with a small leather notebook filled with his handwritten notes about wind patterns, bullet trajectories, and shooting techniques he had developed over 40 years of hunting. The military had issued Sarah a standard sniper rifle like everyone else, but she always felt more connected to her grandfather's weapon. During training exercises, she used the issued rifle to avoid criticism from her superiors. However, when she had free time, she would take the old rifle to the practice range and work on perfecting her aim using her grandfather's techniques. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harris, had noticed Sarah's unusual dedication to the old rifle, but chose not to interfere. He respected her commitment to training, even if he didn't understand her attachment to what appeared to be an outdated weapon. Harris had seen many soldiers come and go, and he recognized that Sarah had natural talent that went beyond her equipment choices. The unit was stationed at a forward, operating base in a mountainous region where long-distance precision shooting was often required. The terrain reminded Sarah of the Colorado mountains where her grandfather had taught her to shoot as a child. She remembered him saying that the secret to great marksmanship wasn't just about having the best equipment, but understanding the relationship between the shooter, the weapon, and the environment. During mess hall conversations, other soldiers would discuss the latest military technology and advanced weaponry. Sarah listened quietly while they debated the merits of different rifle scopes and electronic targeting systems. She knew they saw her as old-fashioned, perhaps even stubborn, for clinging to her grandfather's rifle, but something deep inside told her that the weapon held secrets that modern technology couldn't replicate. The leather notebook her grandfather had left contained detailed observations about shooting at extreme distances. His notes mentioned shots that seemed impossible according to conventional military training. Sarah had studied every page, trying to understand the mathematical calculations and environmental factors her grandfather had considered. Some of his techniques contradicted what she had learned in sniper school, but his results spoke for themselves. As weeks passed at the base, Sarah continued to face good-natured ribbing about her choice of weapon. Even some of the newer recruits joined in the jokes, calling her rifle the antique or grandpa's relic. Sarah took the teasing in stride, but she was determined to prove that her grandfather's weapon and techniques were more than just sentimental attachments. The opportunity to demonstrate the rifle's capabilities would come sooner than anyone expected. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy activity was increasing in the surrounding mountains, and the unit would soon be called upon to provide long-range reconnaissance and support. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness, knowing that she might finally have the chance to put her grandfather's teachings to the ultimate test. Unknown to her fellow soldiers, Sarah had been keeping her own detailed records of practice sessions with the old rifle. She had achieved remarkable accuracy at distances that surprised even her, but she had kept these results private. The notebook she inherited wasn't just filled with her grandfather's notes anymore. It now contained her own observations and improvements to his techniques. Late at night, when the base was quiet, Sarah would sometimes take out her grandfather's rifle and clean it by lamplight. She would read through his notes again, trying to imagine the man who had developed such precise shooting methods without any formal military training. The rifle felt like a connection to him, and she was determined to honor his memory by proving that his unconventional approach to marksmanship had real value. The stage was set for a confrontation between old wisdom and new technology, between tradition and innovation. Sarah didn't know it yet, but events were about to unfold that would silence the laughter of her fellow soldiers forever. The mountains held challenges that would test not only her shooting skills but also her faith in her grandfather's legacy. The news of Sarah's record-breaking shot spread through military command faster than anyone had expected. Within hours of returning to base, Sarah found herself summoned to meet with General Patricia Williams, the commanding officer for the entire regional operation. The general had flown in specifically to understand how an impossible shot had been achieved using equipment that predated modern military technology by several decades. General Williams was a career military officer who had risen through the ranks by understanding both the capabilities and limitations of military equipment. She had reviewed thousands of after-action reports during her career, but nothing had prepared her for the documentation surrounding Sarah's 3,210-meter shot. The ballistics analysis indicated performance that exceeded the theoretical capabilities of any known sniper system. Sarah entered the general's temporary office carrying her grandfather's rifle and the leather notebook that had guided her calculations. She felt nervous about meeting such a high-ranking officer, but she was also proud of what she had accomplished. The rifle that had been mocked by her fellow soldiers was now the centerpiece of a military investigation that would reshape understanding of long-range marksmanship. General Williams examined the rifle with the careful attention of someone who understood weapons systems. The craftsmanship was obviously superior, but the technology appeared to be decades behind current military standards. She asked Sarah to explain how such an old weapon had achieved results that modern equipment couldn't match, and Sarah began describing her grandfather's techniques in detail. So, leather notebook became the focus of intense interest as Sarah explained the calculations and environmental observations that had guided her shot. General Williams recognized that the notebook contained insights that could revolutionize military sniper training. The techniques described were based on decades of practical experience, rather than theoretical calculations, and they clearly worked under conditions that challenged conventional equipment. Sarah told the story of her grandfather's hunting expeditions and how he had developed his marksmanship techniques through years of experimentation in mountain environments. Miguel Martinez had never received formal military training, but his understanding of ballistics and environmental factors surpassed what was taught in professional sniper schools. His techniques were based on observation and intuition rather than electronic measurements. General Williams was particularly interested in understanding how Sarah had learned to apply her grandfather's techniques in a modern military context. The transition from hunting to combat shooting involved different pressures and considerations, but Sarah had successfully adapted the core principles. Her ability to read environmental conditions and time her shot perfectly had been the key to achieving the impossible distance. So, General ordered a comprehensive analysis of both the rifle and the shooting techniques to determine whether they could be incorporated into standard military training programs. Weapons experts would examine every aspect of the rifle's construction, while ballistics specialists would study the mathematical formulas in Miguel Martinez's notebook. The goal was to understand whether these techniques could be taught to other military snipers. Sarah learned that her shot was being submitted for official recognition as a world record. The documentation process would be extensive, involving multiple government agencies and international organizations that tracked military achievements. The 3,210-meter distance had exceeded previous records by a significant margin, and the circumstances of the shot made it even more remarkable. The other members of Sarah's sniper team were also called in to provide testimony about the conditions and circumstances surrounding the record shot. Their initial skepticism about Sarah's equipment had been replaced by genuine respect for her achievement. Several of them requested permission to study her grandfather's techniques in hopes of improving their own capabilities. General Williams made a decision that would change Sarah's military career permanently. She recommended Sarah for immediate promotion and assignment to an elite sniper training program, where she could help develop new techniques based on her grandfather's methods. The military wanted to understand how traditional marksmanship skills could complement modern technology rather than being replaced by it. The leather notebook would be preserved in military archives as a historical document that contributed to advances in long-range shooting techniques. Copies would be made available to sniper training programs, but the original would remain with Sarah as recognition of her grandfather's contributions to military marksmanship. Miguel Martinez had never served in the military, but his techniques would now influence military training for generations. Sarah's grandfather's rifle would also be preserved, but not in a museum as some had suggested. Instead, it would continue to serve as Sarah's primary weapon, while she developed training programs based on Miguel's techniques. The rifle had proven its worth in the most demanding circumstances possible, and it deserved to remain in active service with the soldier who understood its capabilities best. The story of the record shot began appearing in military publications and eventually reached civilian media. Sarah became known as the soldier who had achieved the impossible using her grandfather's hunting rifle. The story captured public imagination because it represented the triumph of traditional skills over high technology, showing that human intuition and experience still had value in an increasingly automated world. Years later, Sarah would establish a training program that combined traditional marksmanship techniques with modern equipment. Students would learn to use electronic systems while also developing the environmental awareness and intuitive shooting skills that her grandfather had mastered. The program became highly successful, producing snipers who could adapt to challenging conditions that defeated purely technological approaches. The 3,210-meter shot remained a military record that was never officially broken. Though several attempts were made using increasingly sophisticated equipment, Sarah's achievement stood as proof that the most advanced technology couldn't replace the wisdom and experience of a master marksman who understood the fundamental principles of precision shooting. Sarah kept her grandfather's rifle in perfect condition throughout her extended military career, using it for training exercises and demonstrations of traditional shooting techniques. The weapon that had once been dismissed as obsolete became one of the most famous rifles in military history, inspiring countless soldiers to appreciate the value of both old wisdom and new technology in achieving excellence.